Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today's video is part 2 of teaching you about child language acquisition. Today we will be talking about syntax and morphology. So essentially, how do children acquire grammar? And how do they acquire the more complex forms of words? So for example, how do children acquire the past tense? How do they learn about plurals? In part 1 of this video, we talked about how children acquire speech sounds, so phonology. If you missed it, it'll be linked somewhere in the description in this video. I don't know yet. But this is a continuation of my linguistics lecture series. I hope you find them interesting. I hope you find them relaxing. I hope you learn something. So, without any further ado, let's get straight to it. So, to review from last time, children, infants and toddlers, go through predictable stages of language acquisition. All typically developing infants and toddlers will acquire a native language or languages. And children around the world go through similar stages of language acquisition. We'll be talking about some English-specific examples today. However, the way that children acquire language is pretty similar around the world. Number 2, infants can perceive many more sounds than they can produce. This was called the Vis phenomenon. And 3, researchers have developed novel methods to test infant and toddlers' language perception. So there are different ways that linguists go about learning how children perceive and produce language, even when children don't have the words to describe what they're thinking. So let's get to the heart of today's topic, which is child development of morphology, which means words, and syntax, which means grammar. Morphology is the study of how words combine with other parts to create more complex meaning, and syntax is how those words combine with each other to create a complex sentence or utterance. So, in our previous video, we talked about how children by 1 year old can typically produce one-word utterances. They may or may not use appropriate sentence intonation. Bottle versus bottle. 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 They can use different intonations to ask questions, make requests, or just state a declarative. And by 18 to 24 months old, children are in the 2-word stage. And they can make some predictable kinds of utterances. This is true across languages. So a children might be able to combine an action with an object, kick ball. They can do an action plus a location, sit chair, an entity and its location, teddy bed, a possessor and the thing that is possessed, so mama book, baby bottle, an entity and an attribute, so something that describes that entity or object, block red, and a demonstrative, so that's this and that, and an entity, so this shoe, that shoe. As discussed in our previous video, it might be pronounced differently. They might use a childlike pronunciation, so not this shoe, but this shoe, or dat book. but they can create a couple of different kinds of two-word utterances. But what's missing? There's a couple big things that are missing. By this stage, children do not have a grasp of adverbs, and they're missing a lot of grammatical function words. So they don't yet have things like preposition, Teddy on the bed. They don't have a and the, those articles or determiners, as linguists call them. So they don't say sit on the chair or kick the ball. They're just saying purely contentful words, words that have a concrete meaning and are representative of things in the real world, and not those words that have more abstract meanings. Later on, children begin to develop more complex utterances in the later stages of language acquisition. So they can create longer sequences of words with syntactic organization, and they gradually introduce functional morphemes. So a typically developing child who is raised in an English-speaking household will acquire typically these grammatical functions in this order. First, they learn how to use plural ing. I'm singing, I'm eating, I'm reading. Then plural s, I'm eating cookies. I like cats. Then possessive s, so they can distinguish between a plural s and a possessive s. These are Mama's cookies. Those are Dada's books. I don't know. Then they produce the and a. This is a cat. That is the book. Past tense ed comes a little bit later, then third person singular s, and finally auxiliary be. So they might say I tired, I hungry, I want for a long time, and then eventually they acquire the ability to say I am tired, I am hungry, he is mean. However, an interesting distinction that we see is that this is not how frequently these morphemes are observed in the speech of their parents. So, for example, their parents use possessive s less than auxiliary be. However, children acquire possessive s well before they acquire auxiliary be. This shows us a couple of things. One, that frequency is not the only determiner in how children acquire language. Just because they hear something really often, like the and a, does not mean it will be acquired as quickly as other kinds of grammatical morphemes. So children hear the and a incredibly frequently in adult speech. However, it takes them a while to acquire it. And linguists, honestly, aren't super sure why. There are also a couple of distinct patterns in how children overgeneralize language. So, overgeneralization means that a child extends a rule beyond the context in which it applies. So they've learned a grammatical rule, they've learned a little bit of knowledge about what will become their native language, and then they put it everywhere. So, for example, children will learn past tense ed well before they learn about irregular verbs, and then they will apply past tense ed everywhere. I eated a cookie. I maked a craft. I finded my friend. Hitted, braked, runned, broked, etc. So drowned and broked are examples of how children do learn about irregular past tenses and still overgeneralize and apply past tense ed. So a children knows that break becomes broke, but they also know that ed makes things past tense. So they might say something like, I broked it, he broked it, as opposed to he broke it. The same thing happens for plurals. So a child might say people's, mouses, tooths, and foots instead of the irregular plurals that adults use. But once again, they can learn the irregular plural and then continue to apply that irregular plural morpheme to the end of it. So they might say mices and feets. This is not necessarily because children do not know what the correct form is. However, their brain is still working out the rules of their language. It's an incredibly daunting task for a very young child, and yet they're very good at it, so cut them some slack. This ties back to the FIS phenomenon. Children can perceive errors in adult speech. So if an adult continually says foots or mouses or eated, a child might actually get upset because they know that the adult is speaking incorrectly or ungrammatically. However, when it comes time for a child to produce those same words, they still might say eated and mouses and feets because their brains are just working so hard to produce the correct target word, and it doesn't always happen. But what does morphological overgeneralization tell us about language development? It shows us that young children have an unconscious awareness of morphological rules. They know about past tense ed, they know about plural s, and they're able to apply them at a pretty young age. You may or may not have heard of something called the WUG test. This was a test developed by a bunch of linguists to see if children were just copying words they had heard before, or whether they could apply their morphological knowledge and their syntactic knowledge to novel situations. So they show them a picture. This is a wug. This creature right here is a wug. Now there's another one. There are two of them. There are two wugs. Children can reliably say wugs as a plural, which shows that children know how to use plural s even for words they have never heard before. They would ask some other questions like, here is a wug, here is a wug, and now there's a little one. This is an adult might say a wugling or a wuggette, but children are very likely to just say baby wug. Adults have that more complex morphology to know that ling or et is a diminutive like duckling, gosling. Children haven't quite gotten that far yet. That's not a super common morpheme, and so it makes sense that a child would not have acquired it yet. So a child will just say baby wug. Some other common structures in child speech are some differences in negation. So they might say no baby sleep, no baby sleep, or I no sleep, I no drink milk. They don't yet have do, I don't sleep, or I don't want to drink milk. They lack dew, which is a very, very functionally heavy word in English. It's used very frequently, but it has a very abstract meaning. It carries tense in a lot of instances. And then often for interrogatives, young children will ask questions only through rising intonation. So, give milk, give cookie, or they'll ask WH questions without inversion. They would say, why you sad, or why you are sad, as opposed to why are you sad. Adult speakers will invert the verb and the subject in WH questions. Children won't do that until they get a little bit older. And then we can talk about a little bit about how children develop their lexicon and semantics. So lexicon is essentially the mental dictionary of words that a speaker can produce. And semantics is the study of the meaning of words and their relationships to each other. So think about what your first word was. For a lot of you, it will be mama or dada or papa. That's because these are words that are very, very easy for a child to pronounce. As we discussed in the previous video, one of the stages of child's phonological development or language development is something called canonical babbling. This is when a child repeats one syllable over and over, often a bilabial consonant and ah. So ma 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 ma, ba 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 ba, pa 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 pa. And it's easy for a parent to get very excited and think that they are saying mama or baba or papa, even though the child doesn't really know what they're saying yet. So I'd be curious to know if your first word was not mama or papa, and instead what it was. Mine was bow, because I loved accessories and I loved hair bows, and my first word was bow, because I got so excited when I saw a bow on, I think, like a shirt or something that my mom was buying for me. So children often use semantic overextension, just like they use syntactic overextension or morphological overextension. So a child might say doggy to mean dogs and cats or any four-legged animal. A hat might be anything you can put on your head. Dada might refer to any man, not just necessarily their father. Ball might refer to anything that's round, so balls, marbles, eggs, balloons, etc. And they might also use semantic underextension. This often applies to things that the child has a close relationship with or only interacts with very few of. So baba might specifically mean my bottle and not any other bottles. Bear means my bear and not any other bears. So if a child has a very close relationship with an entity or an object, they might underextend semantic meaning and really only talk about the specific one that they have in mind or interact with frequently. So the big picture: child language learning is unconscious and automatic. It happens with little direct instruction from adults, and it happens naturally at the appropriate development stage. A common feature of child language acquisition is overgeneralization, and this is evidence of their knowledge of rules. It shows that they know things like past tense or plurals, even if they can't apply them perfectly. This also tells us something really important about how children acquire language. And that is that child language is not just an imitation of adults or memorization of adult speech. If children just memorized the things that they heard from adults or just copied adult speech, we would never expect children to make speech errors. Why would they? Adults don't say eated or bis or mouses. Adults say ate and fish and mice. However, children make overgeneralization errors. And that tells us that children are learning these rules in their own right and not just copying everything they hear from adults. This is true across languages. Children will make overgeneralization errors. And the fact that children can identify novel words or make novel utterances also tells us that children are not just directly copying adults. There's one final thing I want to talk about, and I don't have a slide for it, but it's one of the theories about how children develop language, and it's called the critical period hypothesis. If you ever learned a language as an adult, you'll know that it's pretty dang difficult. And there's a hypothesis that children's brains are innately hardwired to learn language, but that around the age of puberty, this kind of switch shuts off. It's this idea that there's something in child brains that is perfectly in tune with learning language, and as we grow up and our primary motivations change, our resources are reallocated away from language learning. There is some evidence of this. One is accents. In fact, phonological acquisition happens even younger than puberty. Children acquire their phonological inventory up until about the age of 6, and if they are exposed to a new language after that age, it is still likely that they will retain some form of an accent. So a child that moves to a new country in elementary school may become a very, very fluent speaker, but they'll likely still retain even a slight accent. And then, if a child moves later in life, around 14 or 15, it will take a lot more effort to acquire a language. This is not to say that adults cannot acquire language or cannot become fluent speakers. However, it obviously requires a lot more effort. There is some other evidence for the critical period hypothesis in the form of feral children who were not exposed to language during the critical period and as such never truly acquired a native language, even when they were reintroduced to society. And we also see this in early deaf communities or isolated deaf children. Isolated deaf children who did not have access to signed language also have difficulty acquiring signed language as a native language if they're exposed to it after the ages of about 13 or 14. This was huge in the deaf rights community when it came to opposition of oral-only education and the ability to access sign language resources for deaf children in hearing families. So, there is some evidence that there is a critical period of language acquisition. It is once again up for debate. Not every linguist agrees with it, and it's just a hypothesis, but I do personally subscribe to the theory that there is a critical period of language development and acquisition. And that's it. That's my speech. As always, I hope you found this interesting. I hope you found it relaxing. If If you have questions or comments about child language acquisition, I'd love to hear them. I'd love to know what your first word was and whether it was an example of overgeneralization or undergeneralization. If there are other topics in linguistics that you'd like to hear more about, please let me know and I will talk about them if I have some sort of knowledge about them. No promises. As always, thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next video. Good night. Good night. Good night.